The Thompson family lived in a small, peaceful town surrounded by tall trees and quiet streets. Their home was always filled with laughter, especially because of their son, Ethan. At just 8 years old, Ethan had a spark that lit up every room he entered. He loved playing outside, drawing colorful pictures and telling silly jokes that made his parents laugh until their sides hurt. For Sarah and Mark, life revolved around their little boy. He wasn't just their child. He was their entire world. But everything changed one fateful afternoon when tragedy struck without warning. Ethan was at the park, a place he visited almost daily, playing on the swings and chasing butterflies with his friends. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, like any other. However, while running across the playground, Ethan tripped and fell into a shallow pond nearby. Despite efforts from bystanders to save him, Ethan didn't make it. The news shattered Sarah and Mark's lives. In an instant, their happy, noisy household became eerily silent. The toys Ethan once played with were tucked away in boxes, gathering dust. His drawings still hung on the fridge, but they now brought tears instead of smiles. In the months following Ethan's passing, Sarah and Mark struggled to cope. Every morning felt heavier than the last. They couldn't bring themselves to go back to work right away. So they spent most of their time sitting in silence or crying together. Friends and neighbors tried to offer comfort, bringing casseroles and offering kind words, but nothing could fill the void left by Ethan's absence. Sleepless nights became their new normal. Sometimes Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she heard Ethan's voice calling her name. When she turned on the light, though, the room was empty. To keep some connection with their son, Sarah and Mark started visiting his grave regularly. It was located in a serene cemetery on the outskirts of town, surrounded by green grass and towering oak trees. Each week they brought fresh flowers, wiped away dirt from the headstone, and talked to Ethan as if he were still there. "We miss you so much," Sarah often whispered, tracing the engraved letters of his name with trembling fingers. Mark usually stayed quiet, kneeling beside the grave and staring at the ground, lost in thought. These visits gave them a sense of closeness to Ethan, even though the pain of losing him never faded. One Saturday morning, about 6 months after Ethan's death, Sarah and Mark arrived at the cemetery as usual. The weather was mild, with a soft breeze rustling through the leaves above. As they approached Ethan's grave, something caught Sarah's eye. A bouquet of lilies, Ethan's favorite flower, lay neatly placed on the headstone. Neither she nor Mark had brought them. Confused, they exchanged worried glances. "Did someone else come here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head, equally puzzled. As they looked closer, they noticed something even stranger. Tiny handprints pressed into the soft soil beside the grave. The prints were unmistakably small, no bigger than those of a child. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark, do you see this?" she stammered. Her husband knelt down to examine the marks more carefully. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no explanation for how they got there. No children had been visiting the cemetery that morning, at least none they'd seen, and the prints seemed too perfect to have been made accidentally. Despite their unease, Sarah and Mark decided not to jump to conclusions. Maybe a kind stranger had left the flowers and the handprints were simply a coincidence. Perhaps a curious child had wandered by and touched the soil out of curiosity. They tried to convince themselves of these possibilities, but deep down, both felt a gnawing sense of doubt. Something about the scene felt off. The air around them seemed heavier than usual, and the cheerful chirping of birds overhead suddenly sounded distant, almost muffled. It was as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. On the drive home, neither Sarah nor Mark spoke much. Their minds raced with questions they couldn't answer. Who could have left the flowers? And why would anyone press their hands into the dirt near Ethan's grave? The more they thought about it, the less sense it made. By the time they reached their house, Sarah's anxiety had grown into full-blown dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to communicate with them. But who? And what did it mean? That night, as Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, She replayed the day's events over and over in her mind. The image of those tiny handprints haunted her. She found herself wondering if Ethan somehow knew they visited him every week. Could he be reaching out to them from beyond? The idea seemed impossible, yet part of her wanted to believe it. After all, losing Ethan had left such a gaping hole in her heart that she clung to any shred of hope, no matter how irrational it might seem. Meanwhile, Mark wrestled with his own emotions. He wasn't ready to entertain supernatural explanations, but he couldn't deny that the situation was bizarre. Deep down, he feared what the truth might reveal. What if someone, or something, was watching them? Or worse, what if they uncovered something they couldn't handle? For now, all they could do was wait and see if anything else unusual happened. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the boundaries between them. The days following their strange visit to Ethan's grave passed slowly for Sarah and Mark. At first, they tried to convince themselves that the lilies and handprints were just a coincidence, perhaps the work of a thoughtful neighbor or another grieving family member who wanted to pay respects. But as the week went on, their unease only grew stronger. Every time they thought about those tiny handprints pressed into the soil, an icy chill ran down their spines. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something unusual was happening. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table, Sarah decided to voice what had been weighing heavily on her mind. "Mark," she began hesitantly, "do you think... could it be Ethan?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, and she avoided looking directly at him. Mark sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. He didn't know how to respond. The idea of their son somehow reaching out to them from beyond the grave sounded both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because it meant he might still be with them in some way. Terrifying because it opened the door to questions neither of them felt prepared to answer. Despite their doubts, the couple couldn't dismiss the growing list of strange occurrences surrounding Ethan's grave. A few days after their initial discovery, they returned to find more evidence that defied explanation. This time, tucked under a small rock near the headstone, was a drawing done in bright crayon colors. The picture showed stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, a scene reminiscent of the artwork Ethan used to create when he was alive. Sarah picked up the paper with shaking hands, tears welling in her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of thing Ethan would draw," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark stared at the drawing, unable to form words. His heart raced as conflicting emotions swirled inside him: hope, fear, confusion, all battling for dominance. As if the mysterious drawings weren't enough, other oddities began appearing too. One afternoon, as Sarah knelt beside the grave to place fresh flowers, she noticed faint footprints trailing away from the site. They were impossibly small, much like the ones they'd seen before, but this time they led toward a nearby tree, before disappearing entirely. She called Mark over, pointing them out. Together, they followed the trail, searching for any sign of where the prints might have come from, or who might have left them, but found nothing conclusive. Still, the sight sent shivers down their spines. Who, or what, could leave such marks? And why did they always seem connected to Ethan? To make matters worse, Sarah started hearing things during their visits to the cemetery. At first it was subtle, a rustling sound in the bushes or the distant caw of a crow perched high in a tree. But soon, the noises became harder to explain. On one particularly eerie visit, as they stood quietly by the grave, Sarah swore she heard a faint whisper carried by the wind. The voice was soft and childlike, calling out two simple words: "Mommy" and "Daddy." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Turning to Mark, she asked, "Did you hear that?" But he shook his head, his expression tense. He hadn't heard anything. Not this time, anyway. But the look on Sarah's face told him she wasn't imagining things. These unexplainable events weighed heavily on the couple. Nights became restless, filled with tossing and turning as they replayed each moment in their minds. Neither of them could shake the feeling that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with them. Yet the uncertainty gnawed at them, constantly. Was it really Ethan? Or was there another explanation they hadn't considered? The lack of answers only deepened their anxiety, leaving them trapped in a cycle of hope and dread. Desperate for clarity, Mark suggested setting up a security camera to monitor the gravesite. If we can catch whatever or whoever is doing this on video, maybe we'll finally understand what's going on, he said, his tone resolute. Sarah hesitated at first. Installing a camera felt intrusive, almost disrespectful, but her need for answers outweighed her reservations. Reluctantly, she agreed. The next day, they purchased a discreet, weatherproof camera and mounted it on a nearby tree, angling it to cover the area around Ethan's grave. As they adjusted the lens, Sarah whispered a quiet apology to her son. "I'm sorry if this bothers you, sweetheart," she murmured. "We just want to know." Once the camera was in place, Sarah and Mark returned home, their nerves stretched thin. They checked the footage daily, hoping to find some clue that would explain the strange happenings. For several nights, the recordings showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual sights and sounds of the cemetery, groundskeepers tending to the grounds, birds flitting between branches, and the occasional visitor paying their respects. But despite the mundane footage, the couple couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was lurking just out of view. Each blank recording only heightened their anticipation, making them wonder when, or if, they'd finally uncover the truth. Their patience was tested further when yet another bizarre occurrence took place. During one of their routine visits, Sarah discovered a toy car resting against the base of Ethan's headstone. It was old and slightly worn, its red, paint chipped in places, but it was unmistakably one of Ethan's favorite toys. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked it up, memories flooding back of watching her son zoom the car across the living room floor. How could this toy possibly have ended up here? They hadn't brought it, nor had anyone else mentioned visiting the grave recently. The discovery left them reeling, their minds racing with possibilities. By now, Sarah and Mark were emotionally drained. The constant barrage of inexplicable events had taken its toll, leaving them exhausted and overwhelmed. They alternated between clinging to the hope that Ethan was somehow reaching out to them and fearing that they were losing touch with reality. Friends and family urged them to seek professional help, but they resisted, unwilling to let outsiders judge their experiences. Instead, they clung to each other, drawing strength from their shared grief and determination to uncover the truth. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in their home became palpable. Even mundane tasks like cooking dinner or folding laundry felt heavy, overshadowed by the mystery unfolding at the cemetery. Sleep eluded them, replaced by restless nights spent staring at the ceiling or replaying fragments of the past in their minds. Yet amidst the chaos, one thing remained clear. They couldn't give up. Whatever was happening at Ethan's grave, they owed it to their son and to themselves to see it through to the end. Little did they know, the footage waiting for them on the camera would soon reveal far more than they ever imagined. Sarah and Mark's anticipation grew with each passing day as they waited to review the security camera footage. The thought of finally uncovering the truth about the strange occurrences at Ethan's grave consumed their thoughts. They had set up the camera hoping for answers, but neither of them could have predicted what they were about to witness. Every time they sat down to check the recordings, their hearts raced. What if they found something that confirmed their worst fears? Or worse, what if they discovered something beyond comprehension? Finally, on a quiet evening after dinner, they decided it was time to face the recordings head-on. Sitting side by side at the kitchen table, Mark connected the camera to his laptop while Sarah nervously twisted her fingers together. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy black and white footage from the cemetery. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Leaves swayed gently in the breeze, shadows lengthened as the sun dipped below the horizon, and an occasional visitor passed through the frame. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened, just the routine sights and sounds of the graveyard. But then, as midnight approached, something changed. The footage showed a figure approaching Ethan's grave under the cover of darkness. It moved, slowly, almost hesitantly, its shape barely visible against the dim backdrop of moonlight filtering through the trees. Sarah leaned closer to the screen, squinting to make out more details. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't respond. He was too focused on the figure now standing near the headstone. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though it floated rather than walked. The figure bent down beside the grave, lingering there for what felt like an eternity before straightening again. As the video continued, the camera captured something even more unsettling. The figure turned slightly, revealing glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness like two tiny flames. Sarah gasped, clutching Mark's arm tightly. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, unable to look away. Those eyes weren't menacing. They were eerily familiar. They reminded her of Ethan's playful gaze during bedtime stories or when he'd peek around corners playing hide-and-seek. Could it really be him? She wanted to believe it, but fear held her back. If this was Ethan, why did he appear so different? But the footage didn't stop there. As the shadowy figure lingered near the grave, another form began to take shape beside it. A smaller silhouette, unmistakably childlike. This second figure knelt beside the headstone, pressing its hands into the soft earth. Even through the low-quality resolution of the camera, Sarah and Mark recognized the exact spot where the tiny handprints had appeared earlier. Their blood ran cold as realization dawned. Whatever, or whoever, was visiting Ethan's grave was responsible for all the strange signs they'd been finding. For several long moments, the couple sat frozen, staring at the screen, without speaking. The implications of what they'd just witnessed weighed heavily on them. Was this proof that Ethan's spirit was still present, or was it something else entirely? Mark broke the silence first, his voice hoarse with emotion. Do you think that's really him?" he asked, his words barely audible. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "But it feels like him." The weight of the discovery left them shaken. Watching the footage over and over didn't provide any clarity. It only deepened their confusion. They rewound the video multiple times, analyzing every detail, searching for anything that might explain what they were seeing. Yet no matter how many times they replayed it, the same chilling image remained. The glowing-eyed figure hovering protectively over the childlike silhouette. It was both beautiful and terrifying, filling them with equal parts hope and dread. Unable to process everything alone, Sarah suggested reaching out to someone who might help them understand what they'd captured on film. She remembered hearing about paranormal investigators from a coworker who claimed her aunt had once consulted such experts after experiencing unexplainable events in her home. Though skeptical at first, Sarah now clung to the idea that professionals might offer some insight into their situation. Mark agreed reluctantly, though part of him still resisted the notion of involving outsiders. Still, they both knew they couldn't handle this alone anymore. After some research online, they contacted a local paranormal investigation team, recommended by several reviews. The group, known as Spectral Seekers, specialized in cases involving alleged supernatural activity. When Sarah explained their story over the phone, the investigator on the other end listened intently before assuring her they'd be happy to assist. "We'll bring all our equipment," the woman said confidently. "If there's something there, we'll find it." Though her tone was reassuring, Sarah couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. What if the investigators found nothing? Worse yet, what if they uncovered something far darker than either of them imagined? In the days leading up to the team's arrival, Sarah and Mark prepared themselves mentally and emotionally. They revisited the cemetery one last time before the investigation, leaving fresh flowers and a note addressed to Ethan. "We're trying to understand," Sarah wrote, her handwriting shaky. "Please guide us if you can." As they placed the note beneath a rock near the headstone, they felt a mix of determination and apprehension. Whatever awaited them, they were ready, or as ready as they could ever be. On the morning of the scheduled investigation, Sarah woke early, her mind racing with questions. Would the team confirm their suspicions? Could science explain the glowing-eyed figure and the tiny handprints? Or would they leave even more baffled than before? Mark tried to stay calm, reminding himself that answers, no matter how unsettling, were better than endless uncertainty. Together, they drove to the cemetery, meeting the investigators at the entrance. The team arrived equipped with an array of gadgets designed to detect supernatural phenomena: EMF detectors, infrared cameras, digital, audio recorders, and temperature sensors. As they set up their equipment around Ethan's grave, Sarah and Mark watched silently, their nerves stretched taut. One investigator introduced herself as Claire, explaining that they would conduct a thorough sweep of the area while recording data. "If there's any kind of presence here," she said gently, "we'll do our best to communicate with it." For hours, the team worked tirelessly, asking questions aloud in hopes of eliciting responses. "Is anyone here with us tonight?" Claire called out, her voice steady. "Can you give us a sign?" The air grew colder as dusk settled over the cemetery, sending shivers down Sarah and Mark's spines. Suddenly, one of the EMF meters began to spike wildly, its needle jumping erratically despite no apparent source of electromagnetic interference nearby. Everyone froze, exchanging wary glances. Then came the whispers. Faint, but unmistakable, they echoed through the silent night. A chorus of disembodied voices layered atop one another. Claire quickly activated her digital recorder, capturing the sound for later analysis. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark stood rooted to the spot, their hearts pounding. Amidst the cacophony, one voice rose above the rest, a small, clear voice that sent chills coursing through their bodies. "Mommy?" it called softly. "Daddy?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she clasped Mark's hand tightly. There was no denying it now. Something, or someone, was reaching out to them. Whether it was truly Ethan or something else entirely remained unclear, but one thing was certain: they were no longer alone in their grief. The journey ahead promised to be difficult, but for the first time in months, Sarah and Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were closer to finding the closure they so desperately needed. The paranormal investigation team worked late into the night, their equipment humming softly as they meticulously documented every detail of the strange occurrences at Ethan's grave. Sarah and Mark stood nearby, watching intently, but feeling like outsiders in their own story. The investigators moved with practiced precision, setting up cameras, adjusting sensors, and asking questions aloud in calm, measured tones. Despite their professionalism, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a shared understanding that something extraordinary might be unfolding before them. As the hours passed, more unusual phenomena began to manifest. The temperature around the gravesite dropped sharply without warning, sending icy tendrils snaking through the group. Claire, the lead investigator, glanced at her thermometer and frowned. "It's about 15 degrees colder here than it is just a few feet away," she remarked, jotting down notes on her clipboard. Mark shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself, while Sarah wrapped her arms across her chest. Neither of them needed scientific confirmation to know that this wasn't normal. It felt otherworldly, almost deliberate. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible over the rustling leaves and distant hum of traffic. But as the team listened closely, the sounds grew clearer, layered voices overlapping one another, some high-pitched and childlike, others deeper and indistinct. Claire immediately activated her digital recorder, capturing the eerie symphony for later analysis. She instructed everyone to remain silent so they could isolate any potential EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. For several minutes, the only sounds were the soft clicks of equipment and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. Suddenly, a single voice rose above the rest. It was unmistakably young, filled with warmth and familiarity. "I miss you," it said, the words barely louder than a breath. Sarah gasped, clutching Mark's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, "That's him. That has to be Ethan." Mark nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. Even the investigators exchanged uneasy glances, though they remained focused on their task. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered unexplainable activity, but something about this case felt different, more personal, more raw. Claire paused the recording session briefly to address Sarah and Mark. "Based on what we've seen tonight," she began carefully, "it seems likely that your son's spirit hasn't fully crossed over. Sometimes, when someone passes, suddenly or tragically, especially a child, their energy can linger because they aren't ready to let go, or maybe because they sense that their loved ones aren't ready either." Her explanation made sense, even if it was difficult to hear. Both parents had spent months consumed by grief, unable to imagine life without Ethan. Could their unresolved emotions have kept him tethered to this world? The idea weighed heavily on Sarah and Mark. On one hand, it offered a glimmer of hope, that Ethan was still with them in some form. On the other hand, it forced them to confront the possibility that their pain might be preventing him from finding peace. They sat together on a nearby bench, holding hands as they processed everything they'd learned. Claire approached them gently, offering advice. "If you want to help him move on," she said, "you'll need to find a way to say goodbye, not just in words but in your hearts. He needs to know that it's okay for him to leave." Her words struck a chord with both of them. Though saying goodbye sounded unbearable, they realized it might be the only way to truly honor Ethan's memory. Over the next few days, Sarah and Mark poured their energy into preparing for a final visit to the cemetery. They gathered items that reminded them of happier times with their son, his favorite stuffed bear, a toy car he'd played with endlessly, and a collection of drawings he'd made during his short life. They also wrote heartfelt letters, expressing their love and gratitude for the joy he'd brought into their lives. Each word was painful to write, yet cathartic in its own way. When the day finally arrived, Sarah and Mark returned to the cemetery, alone, leaving the investigators behind. They wanted this moment to be private, a sacred space where they could connect with Ethan without distractions. As they approached his grave, the atmosphere felt different somehow, calmer, almost expectant. The golden light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Birds chirped cheerfully overhead, adding a touch of serenity to the otherwise somber scene. Kneeling beside the headstone, Sarah placed the items they'd brought in a small circle around the grave. She arranged them carefully, taking care to position each object just right. When she finished, she leaned back on her heels and took a deep breath. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice trembling, "we're here today to tell you how much we love you, and how proud we are of the beautiful boy you were." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, but she didn't stop. Beside her, Mark joined in, his voice thick with emotion. "We miss you so much, buddy," he said, his gaze fixed on the engraved letters of Ethan's name. "But we want you to know that it's okay to let go. You don't have to stay here with us anymore." For several minutes they alternated between speaking and sitting in silence, allowing their words to sink in. They encouraged Ethan to take whatever steps he needed to find peace, promising him that they would always carry his memory in their hearts. It was one of the hardest things they'd ever done, but also one of the most meaningful. By the time they stood up to leave, the weight on their shoulders felt slightly lighter, as if they'd taken the first step toward healing. Before turning to go, Sarah glanced back at the grave one last time. In that moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter, the kind of giggles Ethan used to share whenever he was playing outside. She smiled through her tears, squeezing Mark's hand tightly. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. It felt like a sign, a message from Ethan letting them know he was listening. The drive home was quiet, but peaceful. For the first time in months, Sarah and Mark allowed themselves to feel a sliver of hope. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It never is after losing someone so precious. But they also believed that Ethan was guiding them toward closure. Whatever happened next, they vowed to face it together, drawing strength from the love they still shared for their son. Little did they know, The camera installed near the grave would soon capture something breathtaking, a final farewell that would change everything they thought they understood about life, death, and the bonds that transcend both. The days following their emotional visit to Ethan's grave were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety for Sarah and Mark. They had poured their hearts into the farewell, leaving behind cherished mementos and heartfelt words in hopes of helping their son find peace. Yet, as they waited for the security camera footage from that night, doubt began to creep back into their minds. Had Ethan truly heard them? Was he ready to let go? Or would they be left with more questions than answers? Finally, the moment arrived when they felt ready, or as ready as they could ever be, to review the recordings. Sitting once again at the kitchen table, Mark connected the camera to his laptop while Sarah nervously fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. The screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar grainy black and white footage of the cemetery under the cover of darkness. At first, everything seemed quiet and still, just the usual rustling leaves and distant hum of nocturnal insects. But as the video progressed, an unmistakable shift occurred. Around midnight, a soft glow began to emanate from the area surrounding Ethan's grave. It started faintly, almost imperceptibly, like the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Slowly but surely, the light grew brighter, enveloping the headstone in a warm, golden radiance. Sarah leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Mark didn't respond. He was too transfixed by what he saw unfolding before them. Within the glow, a figure began to take shape. Unlike the shadowy, eerie presence they'd witnessed in earlier footage, this figure was different. It wasn't menacing or unsettling. Instead, it exuded a sense of calm and familiarity. As the image became clearer, Sarah gasped audibly. Standing near the headstone was a small boy, his silhouette unmistakably resembling Ethan. He wore the same striped shirt and sneakers he'd loved during his lifetime, and his tousled hair framed his face in a way that made Sarah's heart ache with both joy and sorrow. The boy moved slowly, almost shyly, toward the items Sarah and Mark had left behind. He knelt beside the stuffed bear, running his hand gently over its fur before picking it up and holding it close to his chest. Then, he turned his attention to the toy car, rolling it along the ground just as he used to do in their living room. Watching him play brought tears streaming down Sarah's face. "It's him," she choked out, clutching Mark's arm tightly. "That's our Ethan." But the most breathtaking moment came next. After interacting with the toys, the boy stood up and faced the camera directly. Though his features remained slightly blurred, there was no mistaking the expression on his face, a mixture of love, gratitude, and contentment. His lips moved silently, forming two simple yet profound words. "Thank you." Though no sound accompanied the gesture, the message was clear. Ethan had heard their words, felt their love, and understood their intentions. As quickly as it had appeared, the glowing light began to fade, taking the boy's silhouette with it. Within moments, the gravesite returned to its usual state, quiet, serene, and bathed in moonlight. Sarah and Mark sat frozen, their eyes glued to the screen long after the footage ended. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. When Mark finally broke the silence, his voice was hoarse with emotion. Do you think he's at peace now?" he asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded slowly, wiping away her tears. "I think so," she replied softly. "He knows we love him, and he knows it's okay to let go." Though the sight of Ethan's apparition should have been terrifying, it wasn't. Instead, it filled them with a sense of closure they hadn't thought possible. For months, they had been trapped in a cycle of grief, unable to imagine a future without their son. Now, however, they felt something new. Hope. Hope that Ethan was safe, happy, and free from the pain of his untimely death. Hope that their bond with him transcended even death itself. Over the next few days, Sarah and Mark found themselves reflecting deeply on everything they had experienced. The glowing figure, the silent message, the warmth of the light. It all pointed to one undeniable, Toaster Ethan had been trying to communicate with them all along. Whether through the mysterious lilies, the tiny handprints, or the disembodied whispers, he had been reaching out in his own way, seeking reassurance and connection. And now, thanks to their willingness to listen and respond, he had finally found peace. In the weeks that followed, life began to feel lighter for Sarah and Mark. The crushing weight of their grief hadn't disappeared entirely. They knew it never would, but it had transformed into something softer, more manageable. They started returning to their routines, finding solace in small moments of joy rather than dwelling solely on their loss. Friends and family noticed the change in them, commenting on how much stronger and more at ease they seemed. Even mundane tasks like grocery shopping or folding laundry felt less burdensome, as if a heavy fog had lifted from their lives. One evening, as they sat together on the couch flipping through old photo albums, Sarah paused on a picture of Ethan laughing at the park. His smile was infectious, capturing the pure happiness he embodied during his short life. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think he wanted us to remember him like this, not as someone who left us too soon, but as someone who brought so much light into our lives." Mark nodded, smiling faintly. "He did," he agreed, "and he still does." Inspired by this realization, Sarah and Mark decided to honor Ethan's memory in meaningful ways. They started a charity in his name, raising funds to support families dealing with childhood accidents and tragedies. They planted trees in local parks, dedicating each one to children like Ethan whose lives had been cut tragically short. They also began sharing stories about him with others, keeping his spirit alive through laughter and love. These acts of kindness not only helped them heal, but also allowed them to channel their grief into something positive. Despite these efforts, they couldn't help but wonder if Ethan was still watching over them. Occasionally, they'd catch glimpses of signs that felt eerily familiar. A sudden breeze carrying the scent of lilies, a child's laughter echoing in an empty hallway, or a dream where Ethan appeared, waving goodbye with a radiant smile. Each sign served as a gentle reminder that though he was gone, he was never truly far away. One night, as Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she whispered a quiet promise into the darkness. "Ethan, wherever you are, know that we'll always love you," she said softly. "And thank you for showing us that love doesn't end, even when people do." Beside her, Mark reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. In that moment, they both felt a profound sense of peace, a confirmation that their journey with Ethan wasn't over, but simply transformed into something eternal and unbreakable. Though the mystery of his visits had come to an end, the legacy of his presence remained woven into the fabric of their lives. Sarah and Mark knew they would carry Ethan's memory with them forever, not as a burden, but as a source of strength and inspiration. And deep down, they believed that wherever he was now, he was smiling, knowing that his parents were finally at peace too. With the final footage reviewed and Ethan's message of gratitude etched into their hearts, Sarah and Mark made the decision to remove the security camera from the cemetery. It no longer felt necessary. They had received the closure they so desperately needed. The glowing figure, the toys he played with in the golden light, and his silent yet powerful "thank you" were enough to reassure them that Ethan was at peace. Now it was time for them to move forward, not forgetting him but learning how to live alongside the love they still carried for him. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah and Mark visited the cemetery one last time before taking down the camera. The air smelled of fallen leaves and earth, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in warm patches. As they approached Ethan's grave, they noticed something new: a single red maple leaf resting gently on top of the headstone. It hadn't been there during their previous visit, and the timing felt too perfect to dismiss as coincidence. Sarah picked it up carefully, holding it between her fingers. "Do you think this is his way of saying goodbye?" she asked softly, turning to Mark. He didn't answer right away, but his expression softened as he nodded. Whether or not it was truly Ethan's doing, it felt like a final gift, a reminder that even in death, Life continues in its own quiet, beautiful ways. They spent some time tidying up the gravesite, clearing away dried flowers and replacing them with fresh ones. This ritual had become second nature to them over the past months, but today felt different. There was no heaviness in their movements, no lingering sadness pressing down on their shoulders. Instead, they worked side by side in companionable silence, occasionally sharing a smile or a tender glance. For the first time since losing Ethan, they felt a sense of calm, a bittersweet acceptance that while part of their hearts would always belong to him, they could still find joy in living. When everything looked just right, Mark retrieved the ladder they'd brought along and began climbing up to uninstall the camera. Sarah stood below, steadying the base of the ladder and watching him work. As he unscrewed the device from its perch on the tree branch, she glanced around the cemetery one last time. The place that had once seemed so haunting now felt peaceful, almost sacred. She whispered a quiet thank you under her breath, unsure if she was addressing Ethan, the universe, or simply the moment itself. Whatever force had guided them through this journey, she was grateful. Back home, they packed away the camera and all the other equipment they'd used during their investigation. It wasn't easy letting go of these tools. They had become symbols of their quest for answers, but keeping them around would have felt unnecessary now. Instead, they decided to focus on creating new memories, ones that honored Ethan without being consumed by grief. They transformed his old playroom into a space dedicated to the charity they'd started in his name. Bright posters covered the walls, showcasing photos of children who had benefited from the funds raised in Ethan's memory. Toys he once loved were donated to families in need, ensuring that his spirit of generosity lived on. As winter approached, Sarah and Mark found themselves embracing traditions they hadn't thought possible after Ethan's passing. Decorating. The Christmas tree became a poignant yet joyful activity, with ornaments bearing his name hanging proudly among the twinkling lights. On his birthday, they hosted a small gathering of close friends and family, releasing balloons into the sky as they shared stories about the happy times they'd had with him. Each celebration was tinged with sadness, of course, but also filled with laughter and warmth. Slowly but surely, they were finding ways to keep Ethan's memory alive without letting it overshadow their own lives. One evening, as they sat together, by the fireplace sipping hot cocoa, Sarah brought up an idea she'd been thinking about for weeks. "What if we write a book?" she suggested hesitantly, glancing at Mark to gauge his reaction. "Not just for us, but for other parents who might be going through what we did. We could share our story, the struggles, the strange things we experienced, and how we eventually found peace." Mark listened thoughtfully, nodding slowly. "I think that's a great idea," he said finally. "If it helps even one person feel less alone, then it's worth doing." Over the next several months, Sarah and Mark poured their energy into writing the book. They revisited old journal entries, reviewed the paranormal investigation footage, and relived every step of their journey. From the initial shock of losing Ethan to the breathtaking moment when they saw his glowing figure on the screen. Writing it all down wasn't easy. It forced them to confront emotions they had tried to bury. But it was also cathartic. By the time they finished, they felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing they had created something meaningful out of their pain. The book was published under the title A Light That Never Fades, and it quickly resonated with readers across the country. Parents who had lost children reached out to thank Sarah and Mark for sharing their story, saying it gave them hope and courage to face their own grief. Others who had never experienced such loss expressed admiration for their resilience and openness. Through interviews, speaking engagements, and social media, Sarah and Mark continued spreading Ethan's legacy, proving that love transcends even the boundaries of life and death. Despite their newfound public role, they remained grounded in their private moments of remembrance. Every year on Ethan's birthday, they returned to the cemetery, not with sorrow but with gratitude. They left behind a small token, whether it was a drawing, a note, or a favorite treat, imagining him smiling somewhere far beyond the veil. And though they rarely spoke of the supernatural events anymore, They occasionally caught glimpses of signs that reminded them he was still with them. A rainbow appearing unexpectedly after a storm, a child waving at them from across the street, with Ethan's same mischievous grin, or the faint scent of lilies drifting through the air on a summer breeze. Years passed, and life moved forward in ways neither Sarah nor Mark could have predicted. They welcomed new joys into their lives, traveling to places they'd always dreamed of visiting, reconnecting with old friends, and eventually even considering adopting another child. Though nothing could ever replace Ethan, they realized that opening their hearts to new experiences didn't diminish the love they had for him. In fact, it amplified it, allowing them to honor his memory by living fully and fearlessly. One spring afternoon, as Sarah strolled through a park near their home, she paused beneath a towering oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, sheltering a group of children playing tag below. She smiled, watching their laughter ripple through the air. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and imagined Ethan running among them, his cheerful voice joining the chorus. When she opened her eyes again, the scene remained unchanged, but her heart felt lighter than ever before. That night, as she tucked herself into bed beside Mark, she whispered a familiar promise into the darkness. "Good night, Ethan," she said softly. "We'll always love you." And though she couldn't see him, she knew in her heart that he heard her. Love doesn't end when people do. It lingers, grows, and transforms, weaving itself into the fabric of everything we are and everything we become. And for Sarah and Mark, that knowledge was enough to carry them through the rest of their days, hand in hand, with Ethan's light shining brightly within them.